Hello everyone. Today we are going to be making a pillowcase. It is a very simple project to do. You can do it in one day. It probably will take you no more than an hour. You usually want to pick out 3 different types of fabrics. They have to be cotton or cotton-like materials, and I highly recommend washing them and ironing before starting your project, just to get out all the chemicals and the stiffeners and other agents in there from the fabric store. So for today's project, I have a really pretty floral fabric. It has been pre-washed and ironed. For the next piece, we're going to do a blue accent, and so the blue accent will act as pretty much to help break apart some of the really pretty floral bright colors. And then for the cuff of the pillow, we're going to use this really bright pink polka dot. So in the end, it's going to look just like that. So the first thing we want to do is we want to cut the separate pieces into corresponding sizes. So for the first piece we're going to cut is the floral piece, and we're going to cut that into a 26-inch piece. And you want to use rotary cutters for that to try and keep it as straight as possible. This is a rotary cutter that I use often. I absolutely love it. So it's a rotary cutter that I use all the time. I mean, this rotary cutter is probably being beaten to death, but it holds its ground. And you want to use any sort of ruler to try and keep your cut straight. So what we're going to do, get these out of the way, is we're going to want and have the 2 salvages. These are what the salvages are. This is called a salvage, and that is a salvage. Always, from my understanding, is that fabric designers will try and have their logo on there with what it's called and when the date it was printed. And so we're going to try and keep it as straight as possible, salvage to salvage. If the ends don't match up, that's okay. We're going to straighten them out. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to straighten this edge out. So I always want to keep it, straighten it up at least an inch until you know that it's absolutely straight. And I'm going to click this open. Yep. And now you have a straight edge. So, first thing we want to do is flip it around, get it straightened up at the end of our ruler or our cutting mat. I always buy the biggest cutting mat, but that's because I sew a lot. So it's highly recommended if you sew as much as I do. However, if you're just starting out, the best cutting mat for this is probably a 24 by 36 cutting mat, or anything if you're going to be doing it in big pieces. Yeah, so 24 by 36 will probably be sufficient. So now that we have it straightened up, we are going to cut it at 26 inches. And this will be the start of our pillowcase. You want to make sure everything is lined up before you cut it, or else it will be crooked when you make it, and then you just have a crooked pillowcase. All right, and that's it. Your 26 inches. That is the start of your pillowcase. Okay, so the next piece is the accent piece, and this is this blue color. So the accent piece, you don't need very much. You just need 2 inches, because that's just like an accent, something nice to kind of distinguish from the 2 different colors, from the focal and the cuff. So for this, we only need 2 inches, right? Super tiny. So 2 inches. And that's it, 2 inches. So the next piece is the cuff piece. As you can tell, it is extremely crooked. So what we're going to do is we're going to straighten it up. I will also have the written instructions on below this video on how to make this. I will also have a PDF file available for those who want to print it out. It is very simple. You can find this this pattern pretty much anywhere online. The one that I've been using is a modified pattern from Rainy Day Quilts, Quilt School. Their website is rainydayquiltschool.com, and you can find a whole bunch of different patterns on there for quilts and pillowcases and accessories and things like that. So I'm just, in case you want to explore how to make other things. So for the next piece, it is 11 inches, so it is 11 inches for the cuff. Okay, and so the next part is laying it all out so it is easy to put together. What I like about this pattern is that it is what I what I call the burrito method, because you pretty much sew all the top pieces together, and then you roll it up like a burrito, and then you eat it. No, I'm just kidding. You don't eat it. You then you pin it, and then you sew it together, and you flip it inside out, and it's pretty much complete. So it's a really awesome pattern. Okay, before we start doing any pinning, we have to do one preparation for the trim, and that is folding it over. So we're basically going to fold it over from the bottom to the top, and that's all it is. And then we're just going to iron it. So we're just going to fold it like that. And then just iron it. You want to make sure that your iron is super hot with steam, or else the fold will not stick, or it will not hold. And you're going to be fumbling around, and it's not going to be fun when you're ready to sew it all together. Okay. So, and that's it. And you're done. So when you're ready to pin it, there is a procedure. So what we're going to do is we're going to first lay out the cuff material. So first the cuff material with the salvages on both ends. So with the salvages on both ends, with the raw edges on the top and the bottom. The next fabric we're going to put on top is the focus fabric. And usually when you sew right sides together. Well, because this is the burrito method, we're going to be layering. So layering with the pieces facing the right way up. So just a note, it doesn't matter about if the salvages line up or not, because we are going to be trimming those down. What does matter is that the raw edges line up. If those don't line up, then everything's out of whack. So you want to make sure all of the pieces line up, and then the final piece is your trim. And you want to make sure that the folded raw edge is facing up, or else you're basically going to be sewing the folded edge, and then you'll have a raw edge showing, and that's not going to be fun. And then once it's all lined up, you pin it. One thing to take into consideration when you are pinning, you want to pin it with the sharp end facing up. So when you do sew it, it's easier to take out the pins as you're sewing. So when you pin it, you want to pin it this way, right? So as you sew this way, you can just take the pin out. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pin these all up and get it ready for the machine. So for the first part of this project, we're going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just so when we get ready to put all the pieces together, none of the seams are showing. So we're going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay. You want to make sure all of your pieces are lined up. As you can see, the pins are facing that way instead of this way, because they're just easier to pull out as you're sewing, and it's just faster. So we're going to put our foot down, and we're going to start going. So when you first start, you always want to do what I can call the locking stitch. Locking stitch basically means when you move the stitching forwards and then backwards a couple of times, and it just prevents it from unraveling. Okay, forwards, and then backwards, and then forwards, and then we're just gonna go all the way. Just for this, when I pinned it, I didn't pin it all the way to the edge, because sometimes when you do stitch through it, you can actually don't have to take the pins out, which is always great. So Some of them I did pin a little bit closer, some of them I didn't. You just have to be really careful because if you start sewing over some pins, you're going to break some needles and then you're just losing time and losing money. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch through this. I will have other videos up about other things to make and techniques. But since this is my first video, we're just going to play it by ear. I do on my sewing plate, I do have markings on where the stitching line is, but sometimes if you're not sure, you can always measure it. And then there's a couple of fun tricks that you can do on keeping your stitching straight, which I will explain in a different video. I will also have videos on different machines, how to take care of your machine, maybe some troubleshooting videos, but it all depends because every sewing machine is different. As we get towards the end, we're going to do another locking stitch. So forwards all the way, and then backwards, and then forwards. And that's it. That's the first part. There's your seam and their stitch. Okay, for this part, we're going to basically straighten out the salvages. So, because the salvages are uneven, what I'm going to do is basically fold it in half, right? See where that is small right there? I'm going to fold it in half and I'm going to cut it right there to make sure all of the pieces are even. And when I cut it, sometimes I do fold it in half again and make sure that these two pieces line up. As I said again, it doesn't matter about this size or this side because it's just going to be uneven. Yeah, and that side is just going to be even. So I want to make sure that the top is even and not the sides where the salvages are. The raw edges need to be even. And you also want to make sure that the fold on this side is even too versus this side. And see where that is. Well, that is pretty spot on, if I do say so myself, about where it should be. Right? So we're going to go ahead and cut on that line right there. It's okay if some is showing, some of the raw, not the raw edges, some of the salvages are showing because we are going to sew a seam allowance and it will not show in the final product. And that's it. Let's see how it looks. I'd say that is straight. Okay, so here comes the fun part of what we're going to do with this project. we're going to lay it out on the table, and I'm going to show you exactly why they call it the burrito method. Okay, so what we're going to do first is we're going to lay it all out just like that, right? And then we're going to take the edge of the fabric, of the focal fabric, and we're going to roll it up just like a burrito. I suggest rolling it up as tight as you can, because in the end you want to make sure all of the pieces are separated. If they're not separated, you will accidentally sew through layers that you don't want. So you see how the cuff is peeking through, so we want to keep rolling it up until you get almost to the top of the trim. And then you're going to take this piece and you're going to fold it over. Just like that. And then you're going to pin it. And when you pin it, you want to pin it the same way that we did last time, where the pins are facing up. Instead of this way. I will show you. Just like that. And we're going to do it for the whole section. So for this time around, we are going to do a 1/2 inch instead of a 1/4 inch, because we want to make sure that the first stitch that we did, the first stitch that we did is doesn't show when we eventually flip it inside out. Okay, so we're going to do a 1/2 inch. And the first step we do is a locking stitch. And that's basically when the machine goes forwards and backwards a couple of times. And that just prevents it from unraveling. As you can tell, I'm always making sure that my needle is down before I start shifting fabrics, because once you shift the fabric when the needle is up, then your stitches are pretty much out of alignment, and we really don't want that, because it just makes the whole project just be crooked. Okay, also as you're feeding it through the machine, let the machine take the material instead of pushing it. You just want to gently hold it as the machine is feeding it through. We will get some puckering, but that can be easily handled towards the end, depending on your project. Again, we're going to lock it. Open it up. And as you can see, the stitching from before doesn't show. So the top stitching is the first stitch that we did, and then the bottom is just this stitch that we just finished. And then I'm going to show you how to finish it up. Okay, so now we have this tube of fabric, right? So how are we going to turn this tube into a pillowcase? Well, I'm going to show you. So you're going to take the end, right, and you're just going to pull it out. Right? And then what happens is that everything goes with it. You're going to keep pulling until you reach the end. And ta-da! That is your cuff, your accent, and your focal all at once. There is one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning, is that when you do put your focal fabric, make sure that your print is facing up. So what I mean is the design, if it is a animal or a person or a one-way design, you want to make sure that the design is facing towards the top. Some designs where the design faces one way or the other, you want to make sure that the design is facing towards the top of your project, or you're going to have your design upside down. And that's never fun, because then you got to take it all apart. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to iron it. So we're going to iron the cuff from the accent heading towards the top, and we're going to iron this all out. As you can see, it got really wrinkled. And then we're going to finish it up, and then that's it. You're done. Okay, so we're going to iron it. However, when you do iron it, make sure that you get all of the loose threads off, because you don't want any loose threads anywhere on your project, because it just doesn't look nice. You want a nice clean finish, and that means everything needs to be cut and trimmed and ironed. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to iron the accent piece down. Make sure that your iron is hot with lots of steam. If it's not, then it's not going to give you that crisp iron. Okay, so you want to make sure that everything is hot. You want to iron the whole piece. Okay, and then we're going to just follow that all the way down. Make sure there's no folds, there's no loose threads as you're ironing. Just make sure that there's just nothing out of the ordinary when you iron it. What I like to do, I like to take this time to just inspect it. Make sure, basically it's quality control at this point, before you want to start on the next step. Some people like to do this project with just the cuff and the focal. Some of them like to do the cuff, the accent, and then the focal. I personally like it with the accent because it just helps break apart the brightness of the focal fabric, and it just gives it a much cleaner look, I think, anyway. Alright, and then we have some loose threads. We're going to cut those off. Okay, and then iron that, and iron all of these pieces. We do have some from this salvage here, some of the ending design, the manufacturer's print that's okay, because when we do sew it, it's gonna basically sew past that point, so it won't show. But you just have to be careful about that, because if you have tons of white and you sew through it, it's gonna show, and that's not gonna be pretty, especially if you're giving this out as a gift for Christmas, or just for somebody's birthday, or whatever the case may be. You just want to be really diligent about your seam allowances. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pin it and make final adjustments, and then that's it. So this is where we get our this is where we start our final preparations or final stitching. So what we're going to do is we're going to do right sides together, and that is how you always should sew, right sides together, especially when you're putting pieces together, because if you don't, then you'll have seam allowances showing, and that's never fun. For this project, when we pin it, we want to pin it so the two accent pieces right here are matching. So when you pin it, you will see two accent ends, and you want to make sure that they match, right? You don't want it where it's like that, because that doesn't look very nice, and besides, your cuff's like all over the place. Okay, so you want to make sure that the accents are together. If it is off slightly, by maybe like 1/8 of an inch, that's perfectly fine. But you don't want to like pin it and have your cuffs look like that, because that's not attractive. So we're going to pin it. This, you see how this is off? That's okay, because when we stitch it, when we pin it, we're going to straighten those. We're going to straighten those out. And now we're ready to pin. And again, you want to make sure that your pins are facing this direction instead of this direction. It's just easier to sew through when they're all facing the same direction and away from the needle. Pin the places that you know are going to give you difficulty, especially with all of these different layers right there. So I'm going to pin it, and we're going to stitch it, and then if you want to do any finishing seams, I will show you how to do that on 2 different machines. Okay, we are ready to sew. It was a little crooked before, so I took a pair of scissors and straightened it out. For the seam allowance we're going to use a 1/2 inch again. So I'm going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and stitch it all the way towards the bottom, and with the locking stitch. We're going to do a locking stitch for the top of this also, just make sure nothing goes awry. So we did a locking stitch on the bottom, and now we're going to turn it. We're going to do a locking stitch again. Okay, take that out, and there if you want to do finishing touches to it, you can. There are two ways of doing it. The first way is without a serger or an overlock machine, and then the second one is with a serger or an overlock machine. If you don't have one of those, don't worry, because I will show you how to do it without one. You're basically going onto your machine and switching it to a zigzag stitch. A zigzag stitch, which is this one, and you're going to just basically do a zigzag stitch over it, and that will just help it from unraveling. So I will show you how to do that on this machine. And you're basically just going to put the needle in the middle position of your fabric, just like that. Okay, and then it's just going to zigzag over it, just like so. And that will prevent it from unraveling, the seams from unraveling anymore. It's just going to go just like that. Another thing you can do is you can use a pair of pinking shears and cut it, or or just cut it really close to the stitching line right here. So cut this seam allowance piece in half, and that will prevent it from unraveling even more. You actually don't want to put it the zigzag stitch in the middle. That was my mistake. You want to put it right at the very edge of the material, and you want to cut it in half and then do a zigzag stitch. But for right now, I'm going to just show you how to do it for this purpose only. Okay, so you want the zigzag stitch to be like relatively close to the material edge, right? And you want to cut this in half and then do the zigzag stitch. But since I'm going to put it in the serger, it will cut that all off and serge it up. But you want the zigzag stitch to close the seams as close as possible. And that means cutting it in half and then doing a zigzag stitch over it, so it will hold. There are other machines, sewing machines, that have options to do an overlock stitch on the actual machines, but because this is a basic machine, it does not have it. So I'm going to show you how to do an overlock stitch on this using a serger, and then we're going to flip it all out and we're going to iron it. This is my serger. A serger that I use is a Baby Lock Imagine. I love this thing to death. It has only had one issue in the past, and that was because of a user error, so it was on my fault. But it has lasted a long time. The first thing you want to do before you do any serging is you want to take out all the pins. You don't want any pins near this machine, because it will break the mechanisms inside, and it could ruin the knife in your serger. Okay, you want to make sure that the knife is engaged, because what that'll do is it will pretty much even out all of your, like, all the crooked raw edges, and just make it really nice and clean. So you don't necessarily have to lift up the foot for this machine, but sometimes I like to, just to make sure that it like stays even. So we're gonna slowly feed it into the machine, and I will show you exactly what it does. As you can tell, it is cutting the salvages off, not the salvages, the raw edges off, and making the end a lot cleaner than if you were to just leave it as is. I like the serger. I highly recommend buying one if you're going to be doing a lot of sewing. It just makes the seams look so much nicer and a lot cleaner. But if you don't sew a lot, and this is just going to be a one of, just a once every blue moon kind of hobby, don't worry about it. Don't invest money into it, because it's just going to be a waste of time, since it's just going to be sitting in the closet. But if you do sew as much as I do, which is pretty much every day, I highly, highly recommend getting one. Some overlock machines do have seam guides, but they're really fidgety. I just try and use it. I try and just line it up to the end of the plate here, maybe a little more, pretty much till right here, instead of right these seam guides, because they don't really work that well, because it's just a sticker. So I just try and line it up to this piece of plastic here, or just a little over the sewing plate. And what's nice about this is that it cuts your threads for you, so you don't have to deal with them. Okay, see how much nicer that looks with the serging on the end. It just gives it a much cleaner look. Okay. Then we're going to do the bottom. You always want to make sure that you serge over your stitches, because that is basically a locking stitch. And that's the final stitching step. Then we're going to flip it inside out and iron it. Before we do any flipping, we're going to cut all of the stitching, or cut all of the threads. Okay, and then we're going to flip it inside out. See how that matched up? Just like that. You want to make sure that the accent is matching on both sides. It's a little bit off, but it's not extremely noticeable until you absolutely look at it. And I think it's probably because of when I ironed it so that it's not quite showing, but it still looks pretty clean. You want to poke out all of your corners, make sure all of your corners are done. if you have like a chopstick or a fork or something with a pointing edge, but it doesn't cut through, I would highly recommend using those. If not, dowel turners are always a good choice because they pretty much have a sharp edge at the sharp point. Okay, you want to make sure that the corners are relatively poked out, I guess is the word, is the term. And then line to iron. And your corners. Do this just in case. And that's it. And your pillowcase is done.